First, I'd just like to say thanks for everyone joining in and the invitation to speak today. So thanks, Sean, Krista, Emma, and Libby for everything that you do and the work that you do in your field. And to everyone else who's joined in. I know it's quite late, so I figured I'd just do a quick snapshot from my experiences just as a recent graduating doctor from Western Australia. And also my background being in research of rare genetic diseases and community liaison work with a lot of the communities from back home in the Northwest. I'm just thinking that this is going to be a very informal session. It's more of a discussion point at the end is I think the meat of it, and we're open to questions along the way and at the end. So if there's anything to ask, feel free. No judgment zone kind of thing, and this is a place to learn. So first up, I just want to get out of the way that this is not a how-to book, and putting this together, I thought that this would be more of a reference and sort of a guide to help you in your clinical practice with engaging with Indigenous patients and families, and more importantly, to build trust with them with the cultural nuances that we have and differences that we have with mainstream Australia. I'm dialing in from Kaurna country in Adelaide, and so just want to pay our respects from this country and wherever everyone else is dialing in from. So just the first half of this talk was a bit of background just to set the context for my role and positions over the years. From the very start, this is my little community in the northwest of WA called Warralong, or Gundimara is the name for it, for the traditional names. And as you can see, it's very small. We have about a few more houses these days, but around 30 to 40. The population's transient, but most of the time is steady 100. We have a school out there that goes up to primary school. This is where the majority of my family live. My country is out at Midjimaya, and that's about a 2-day drive right to the Great Sandy Desert. And so for a lot of our families, we're displaced due to mining activities that historically happened with colonisation and movement towards Indigenous slaves essentially working on the pastoral stations towards the coast. So these are my roots. This is my grandmother's country, and this is where home is. The next slide, just for a trigger warning, just has a few dead animals from traditional hunting. I just thought it would be nice to share sort of a snapshot of what my day-to-day life looks up there. So if anyone is adverse to that, please look away now, and I can tell you when to rejoin. So back home, we're very fortunate to have a traditional cultural ties, and in terms of the effects of colonisation, we're quite fortunate to still be able to keep that to this day. So a lot of the food up there is reliant to come from the country, whether that's going out for turkeys, and that's what's in that photo there, or kangaroos, right down to what drives our connection to our country, and that's the ceremonies we have every year. It's the song lines that we have describing the landscapes, the animals, the water, and how it all interconnects, and in particular our health. And I thought that it'd just be important to bring these up and bring it all together in terms of a cultural lens and things, and how things are viewed from the Pilbara way. For a map setting, and from people, where Perth is about a 20-hour drive up north. This is, I think, 3 size of Texas, I think, is the geographical distribution of Australia, and in particular WA. It's a long way, and I'm just putting this in perspective as well for later down the track when I talk about more of the clinical yarning aspect about geographical locations of Indigenous peoples, and just the distances we have to travel in many respects to seek the health care that's necessary for our families. And so I just wanted to talk a bit about the programs I'm involved in, and that was the Pilbara Faces and the Life Languages program. After I finished my undergraduate, which was at Sydney University, I got a bit homesick and decided to come back to WA and take a gap year, and really was interested in working in a field that I'd never worked before. And so I managed to cross paths with Professor Gareth Bainham, and he said, "Why don't you get involved in rare and genetic diseases?" And I said to him, "I don't know what that is," from a bar soap. We've had a few lectures on that in uni, but got no idea. So that I guess that my curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to dive into this new and exciting realm of research and work that was going on. And one of the projects I was involved in was the Pilbara Faces, and so we went around with the purposes to try to diagnose children with rare genetic diseases from photographs. And what we saw at the time through the WA Undiagnosed Disease Program, headed up at the Rare Care Centre, is that 25% of the children seen through the program were Indigenous. And this wasn't due to a high prevalence or incidence of rare genetic diseases in Indigenous communities, but simply because they weren't having access to be getting into the services in the first place. So what we did is we partnered up with Cliniface, and they operate out of Curtin University, and we're very fortunate to sort of piggyback on the amazing work that they do. And what they're looking at is objective measurements to diagnose children with rare genetic diseases just through facial phenotyping. And so looking at these subtle facial clues, it helps clinicians out a lot with putting those puzzles together to find a diagnosis. At the time, we put my ugly face in the program, and we found that there's a lot of notable morphological differences with my face, which would then go on to suggest a variety of possible diagnoses. And as you can see in the bottom left-hand corner there, that's all that was listed. And this was because at the time, the best reference range we could find was using an African-American database. And so this is obviously an equitable solution in terms of ways going forward and better improving and lowering those percentages shown before about Indigenous people being undiagnosed for so long. So over 2020, I worked as an Indigenous liaison officer with a lot of my community, and we did a lot of work in particular with building that reference range. And I think that we were the first in Australia to build this database. And so I went all across the Eastern Desert Pilbara communities and got to have a great time back on country and back with my family, and showcasing and also educating people on rare genetic diseases as well as I went along. And so from all that work, at the end of it, we plugged my face using the new database with Aboriginal faces, and surprise, surprise, I've got a normal face, would you believe? And so from this work, we're very fortunate to have also had a few diagnoses and a real application of it as well. So at the Rare Care Centre, there's been about 2-3 cases of children being diagnosed where this tool was able to help clinicians in finding that diagnosis. And I think the examples that have been brought up before is the last little piece, and the final clue was often just the measurement of a tooth was one of them, and the last was the measurement of an ear. So these objective measurements help provide us an accessible, faster and non-invasive way of diagnosing children who are in need. And the second hat I wear is I run a program called Life Languages, and this is to help communicate with Indigenous people who often speak Aboriginal languages at home. So English would be the second, third, fourth language. And it's such an important piece to help with empowering families and patients on their healthcare journey. And this is something I noticed when I was doing the Pilbara Faces project, and I can speak language. I just found it so incredibly difficult to explain the scientific terms. And so what we do is we do a lot of community liaison work with developing resources that's more accessible, understandable, and put in language. And we do a lot of community stakeholder events up in Port Hedland. And these are just a few photos of our antenatal program that we rolled out last year at the local Aboriginal Medical Centre. A lot of my family that's been involved over the years, who's been important in the translation processes as well. And this is just an example of things that these amazing women on that previous slide wanted to see. And this is all focused and catered to first-time mums and bubs, and providing them the information to make the most successful and best delivery possible for their babies. And so we converted a lot of the information that was in English into Aboriginal English, and also Nyangamara, which is one of the spoken languages across the Pilbara. And I'm not sure if the audio will work, hopefully. Maybe not. But yeah,
it's working, we can hear.
Oh, yeah. Good. Yeah, so hopefully it's finished now. Just a short take of an example of people wanting, because we're an oral language, being able to listen to that is just so powerful for people as well. From there, we've done a lot of work in other resource developments as well, and we've worked in ophthalmology, and this would be examples of diabetic eyes, glaucoma, and also procedural videos. And so we've done a lot with intravitreal injections, and explaining to patients and families just how important it is to have those injections. We've done work with Rarest and UNSW with developing more culturally appropriate and understandable material for genetic diagnoses and the journeys and pathways for a lot of the families. And our last piece that we've done is also on gestational diabetes. Some other things we do in terms of responsiveness to what the communities wants. When COVID happened, we obviously put everything down, and one of the big issues that we had from both federal and state was that there was no information coming out in languages for the communities, so people were left in the dark. And so we put up a few of these posters, and it really did create a movement in which they were used across multiple towns and communities across the Northwest and put into 5 different languages in 10 different towns by the end of it. The other interesting part that we're focusing on with the language piece is also looking at computer coding of the languages itself, similar to human phenotype ontology terms shown with our Pilbara faces. And we're looking at hopefully new ways and new language algorithms that can come out and create like a translation service similar to Google Translate for Indigenous languages as well. So yeah, I guess my vision is to be able to write a clinic letter, or anyone for that matter to write a clinic letter in English, and for it to come out in an Indigenous language that someone can understand. And so yeah, that was just setting the context about what I've done, what I'm doing, working next year in Perth as an intern, and then throughout the past 7 years, I've had a lot of experience at a clinical level, both as a student and working my previous jobs. And I thought it'd just be great to sort of focus on sort of high level things when it comes to clinical yarning, and I guess important things for me anecdotally when it comes to talking to families. And this is more applicable to families from traditional and more remote areas, I think. So like I said, I think using this as a guidebook and a reference in terms of making sure you understand the patients and families you're working with, as this wouldn't be applicable to everyone. I've broken it up into looking at into 3 phases. So I think the first would be thinking about, all right, what can I do before the consult, things to think about during the consult, and also afterwards. So before the consult, just touching again on the point that we are such a diverse group of Indigenous people here in Australia. What applies with my little region of the world is so different to the other side. And so I just want you to recognize that, that there are cultural nuances even within Australia. So, one size doesn't fit all. If this were to be applicable to patients and family groups, it would be more so for those in the Central Desert region, Northwest Australia, potentially Northern Territory, and also the more rural areas of Queensland. Starting off, I think there's an important thing that I've noticed over the years is setting up the consult room to make sure you're not facing the families and patients. In many ways, in a cultural sense, it's very respectful not to have eye contact with someone. When you pull up a chair, you always sit next to them, and it's just a sign of and show of respect. So yeah, I guess this is a Google image I brought up of not to set up and how to act in the clinic room, but rather have that side on. Seeking arrangements would be much better. Other things to think about when you want to introduce yourself, if Indigenous people don't make eye contact, that's again another sign of respect. Disrespectful to look in someone's eyes, so it's quite the reverse compared to what mainstream Australia says is respectful by its cultural norms. And the other thing as well is going in with a soft handshake, and handshakes are often the way to greet yourself. During the consult, I had to think about how you build rapport, and just setting the example in a historical distrust and the issues we've had as a nation, and the impacts of colonization. That's still, is very evident in the health space and also in a lot of other industry work across Australia. It often helps to have introductions done by someone who's potentially met the family before, and if that's possible, that's a great way to build that rapport faster. And that might be in the form of other Indigenous staff that work in the clinics, whether that's ALO, nurses, doctors. It really does help having that introduction. If all else fails, always a cup of tea, often a great way and often a sign of respect. As I'm sure it is the same for most people when you go over and catch up with them, sit down for a cuppa. So offering that goes a long way as well. Getting into the more interesting parts for you guys, I guess, is an understanding of the family structures and how those family structures play a role in decision making. Will affect, and what I've seen a lot with consultation with especially rare genetic diseases, is who the person is in the room that you need to deliver information to might not necessarily be the mum or the dad. So I'll get to that point, but before I get there, I just thought I'd explain for some people who may not know, but we do have skin systems in a lot of our traditional communities. And so what I mean by skin systems is not by the color of your skin or the shade of your skin, it's the class and group that you're born into. And so this is done because I think there's a number of theories, but my number one would be back in traditional times, there was often a small genetic pool. And so I think Aboriginal Australians were one of the first to recognize that marrying too close and having consanguineous marriages often led to genetic abnormalities. And so they developed a system in which you could figure out how far down the lineage it would be okay to be considered a potential suitor for a marriage. And so when you're born, you're either born based off your mother or your father, depending on gender. And so you're either following your father's line, which is cyclical, or your mother's line, which is also cyclical. So, for example, I'm Banaka, and that's where the orange arrow is pointing to. And so my father is Milanka, and then my mum's Burungu. And this is, as I said, a cyclical changeover where if I have sons, they will be what their grandfather is. So they'll switch over back to Milanka. But if I have girls, they'll follow the maternal side and be Burungu. And that just happens over and over and over. And I could probably do a whole lecture on this, and it's quite complicated. But the other things to consider here, and there's a point I'll get to next, is that it also decides how we form relationships with people in our community. So often we have avoidance relationships. We can have respect relationships, and that often means not being in the same 200-meter vicinity as someone. And so they're just examples of how extreme it can be when it comes to, showing respect in our culture. But vice versa, you can often have a relationship with a lot of those maternal and paternal figures, depending on your skin group, that they will share the same responsibility as your biological mother and father. So that would be the same for aunties and uncles and grandmothers and grandfathers. I think it's just important to bring up in the context of things. And so what I've seen previously in clinics, breaking bad news, and something I've learned in med school, is that often, it's finding the right person to deliver that information. And in many ways, this is often done internally with family groups. And so what I've seen in the past is a lot of families, you won't deliver key information to the biological parents, and often it will go to the auntie or grandmother, who will then go home and sit down at an appropriate time and do it with them. So I guess that's something to not be surprised about if the kids come in with someone who's not their biological parents. And there's also a lot of stigma I've noticed over the years with Indigenous families and the blame they put on themselves with children born with genetic abnormalities as well. So it's something that it's quite it's difficult to see and witness. but yeah, it's often like a cultural protective factors that families put in place for each other. So yeah, don't be surprised about the shared parenting role. And this old girl's my lovely grandmother, May Walker Chapman. She's got a great story if you want to look her up. She remembers walking out of the desert and seeing white people on camel for the first times. So the other thing to think about when it comes to all this is obviously family history and the pedigrees. One thing to note, especially with traditional families, is that when a loved one passes away, we often don't use their name, and this is for the purposes of letting their spirits go back to country. It's thought that if you use their name whilst they're deceased, you're not letting them go on their journey. So there'll be a period of time, and this is variable depending on how important that person was in the community. And so we often rephrase people's names if they share similar names to Nyabaru. And so Nyabaru is the name that translates to no name. And so when it comes to taking that family history, it can be difficult. And obviously understand the importance. Sitting in your shoes is still a very vital part of what needs to be done. And so I think people are very reasonable these days, and it's not something that you need to tippy toe around. I think it's just having a very firm explanation about why you're doing it. It's just so important. And once people understand that, then I think you'd find that they'd be happy to talk about anything that runs through the family. And so I just put there this little quote about what I might say to an Indigenous family, and feel free to screenshot that, and or read through it at your own time. Other things I've noted, assessing language literacy is such an important part of, empowering people on their journeys, and particular families. Often see, and you often, take pauses and ask the family if they understand. And I've seen this countless times, and being on the other end of it as well, where Indigenous people, particularly if they feel vulnerable, if they're away from home, if they're in a city they've never been to before, have stresses at home, whether that's law and culture, funeral times, often they would want to. There's this culture of wanting to go to the appointments and then wanting to go back as quickly as possible for all these other reasons. And so it's just particularly important to check in and get a firm understanding and grasp of what they know. And often I think it's quite good to, rather than ask if they understand, because often they'll say yes, nod their heads and walk out and think, oh, I've got no idea what that was about. But to actually sit down and ask them what they understand about what we're talking about today. And this is for a number of reasons, obviously health literacy being one, but literacy in general, with a lot of Aboriginal families speaking language. So one other question to ask yourself is whether translation services are required for your meetings as well. And often it could be a spokesperson in which families often ring up loved ones, and that's often me with my family, and just my anecdotal experience is having someone who's in that medical space where they feel comfortable for you to explain what's going on, and they can say it back at a later stage, and a process that's also more digestible, that allows for a bit more time. Some other tools as well in terms of resources. We've done a lot of work with Rarest, and thanks to Emma and Krista over the years, we've worked on developing resources. And so there's often, like I said and mentioned before, it's quite difficult to explain these complex medical terminology, especially at a cellular level. Anatomy-wise, Aboriginal people are great at it, but when it comes down to that cellular, it's quite difficult. And so we've done a lot of work with consultation with families and stakeholders in the Pilbara to look at ways of explaining rare diseases. And we've often used songlines as an example of how genes work and how DNA works in the signaling into the body. And these are just some resources that we work with and put up on Life Languages. And so I think it's just being up to date with resources that might be available. online for Indigenous families and people that you work with. And then after the consult, I've just put up a few points here about issues with follow-up and the complexities that Indigenous families face these days. Number one, as mentioned before, is a geographical location. Make sure you figure out where they're going, where their local services might be. Fantastic tool we use over here in WA is called Mapper, and it's a way for outpatient services to figure out locations of local clinics and put that into perspective of the communities of which Indigenous people live nearby. Other things is sorry business and law and culture often play a huge role and priority in many cases when it comes to having to make the decision about going to the appointment versus saying goodbye to our loved ones and the commitments we have at home. So there's a long list I could go on about that as well in terms of other social determinants, but I'll just leave it at that in terms of just thinking rather than the typical views that we've had previously over the years growing up about Indigenous people and the non-attendance rates and the racism that comes from that. I've noticed throughout my medical degree as well. So just being mindful that there's just so much going on for a lot of families when they go home. There's also, a lot of great resources that I've had a look at, and I'm not too sure whether that'd be similar for genetic master students like yourselves, but from light reading, I'd recommend going to this and having a read through some of the vocabulary as well that's used in this paper. So thank you very much. I guess I'll throw it back to you, Sian, and thank you very much for listening.